And in other words, how do you write a constitution? What kind of life you could have as an academic? And I said, well, you're not going to starve doing this, and you have all this freedom, to study whatever you want to study and publish whatever you want to publish. The academic freedom really appealed to me. Well, one of the great things about an academic career is that if you're sufficiently successful, you get to travel all around the world. And if you're a social scientist, what else would you want to do than go around the world and really see how different societies work? I think society works better when society is educated, when people have some knowledge of what's going on around them. Again, I think if you want to be a good economist, you can't know only economics. If you talk to someone like Ken Arrow, whom I mentioned earlier, I remember having dinner with him at his house some years ago, and he was quoting Shakespeare by the paragraph. He's very knowledgeable about history. That is just a dramatically difficult undertaking. I can't imagine what it's like, getting a whole university off the ground. And you managed to do this in what, 2 years, 3 years? I think it's 3 years. That's just incredible. That could not happen in the United States. It simply couldn't. Okay, let's see. I was a not particularly good high school student, but I was very good at taking tests, at SATs and things like this. And so this is how I got into university. And I went to Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, and I took an economics class in my second year at the university because at the time I was interested in politics and political science. And I'm embarrassed to say this, my mother told me that if I wanted to do this, then I had to know something about economics. So I took an economics class and I just loved it. And I just fell in love with it, and I knew right away that's what I was going to do. And the summer after my second year, I had a summer job. This is what students did back in the day to earn some money for the following year. And it was I was a pool guard working at a swimming pool, and so there was a lot of time when the pool was closed, and so I did some reading, and I read a book, and that book is by Kenneth Arrow, who I think is perhaps the best economist, the greatest economist of the 20th century. And the book is called Social Choice and Individual Values, and this book is about the question of how might one design a mechanism for a society to aggregate the preferences of the individuals in order to make social decisions. And in other words, how do you write a constitution? And it's a theoretical analysis. It's filled with logic and things that look like math, although it's really simpler than that. But and I read this book, and it's a very famous book. I read this book and it just knocked me down. I just thought didn't particularly like the answers to the question, but I loved the fact that you could use tools of formal reasoning in order to think about these very important public issues. How do we design a government, or how do we design a constitution? I thought this was incredible. So that really set me on the path. I finished up my undergraduate degree. I went to the University of California at Berkeley because I got very interested in general equilibrium theory when I was an undergrad. And so I ended going to Berkeley to study with Gerard Debreu, who is one of the, along with Ken Arrow, perhaps the two key people in modern general equilibrium theory. And I studied with them, and I studied with Debreu, and got my PhD. And my first job was at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and I stayed there for 10 years. And I liked Ann Arbor very much, but I had a co-author at Cornell, and Cornell was pretty near to where I grew up, so I could be near my family. My wife's family is also in that part of the country, and so when I had the chance to stay there, that's when I went. And been there ever since. And I moved to Cornell in 1988, so that's a very long time. I knew when I was about 10 years old, I had a discussion with my parents, and I learned, and I really, I wasn't particularly good at school, but I really liked learning stuff. And so my parents were explaining to me about universities, and I realized, they told me that you could just keep studying and you'd go to college, and after you're done with college, you could keep studying and all of that. And then, I learned that one could become a professor and one could just keep on studying forever and ever, whatever you wanted to do. Why would anybody want to do anything else? I had some friends in high school. I grew up in Rochester, New York, which is the home of the University of Rochester, which is a good university. And I had, in particular, one close friend whose father taught in the physics department. A lot of my classmates were not a lot, but several of my classmates were professors' children. So I knew a little bit about what academic life was like. And then when I went to the university, my department was very small. Economics, as you know, is now a very popular subject, and we have hundreds and hundreds of students. But in those days, I was in a graduating class of 35 economics students. So it was psychology. It was the hot field in the early 1970s. So I got to know my professors very well. I was invited to their homes. Went to parties there and stuff like this. And so I got to know what kind of life you could have as an academic. And I said, well, you're not going to starve doing this, and you have all this freedom, to study whatever you want to study and publish whatever you want to publish. The academic freedom really appealed to me. And why wouldn't I want to do that? So that's what I did. It never occurred to me. I have to say that I've always been pointed towards an academic career, which is really strange given my early schooling. But I've been pointed towards an academic career basically all my life. Well, one of the great things about an academic career is that if you're sufficiently successful, you get to travel all around the world. And if you're a social scientist, what else would you want to do than go around the world and really see how different societies work? I've never been. Last year was my first visit to Uzbekistan, my first visit to Central Asia. Who would turn that down, right? And to come last year to this very exciting conference at the university here, that was a lot of fun. And even though we were there for an academic conference, those of us who are connected with what is now the Stone Center, we actually had a lot of interaction with students. And we really like the students. They're really, really hungry, really interested. So when the opportunity came to do the summer school, it just seemed like too much. I say this a lot. It was just too much fun to pass up. So it's just really great talking with the students here. I think they're like universities everywhere. The students are, I will say, differently talented. Some are extremely talented, some not so much, but they're all very eager. I've been really impressed how, when we peek into the room upstairs at odd hours, everybody's working on the projects and the posters. I think the students here are really hungry. And that was very apparent, to me when I was here last year. And so, in America, let me make this distinction, that for many people, it's just a given that they're going to go to the university, that they're going to, graduate. Maybe they're going to get an MBA or something like that. They're going to go get a job. That's the path, And the students just march along the path, and it's a little boring, but that's what they're doing. Here, it's not that way, right? Here, everyone is here because they want to be here. So it's, it's very different teaching, and it's a lot of fun. So first off, I have to say that my primary task at the university now is that I'm an administrator. I have an appointment in two colleges at Cornell. I'm a member of the economics department in Cornell's College of Arts and Sciences. And I am also a member of a department of information science. You might wonder what information science is. We wonder too. We talk about it all the time. And this is in the Ann S. Bowers College of Computing and Information Science at Cornell. And in that college, I'm also an associate dean. And I'm spending, I did not get a lot of research done this year. I spent a lot. We're a new college at Cornell. You can imagine all of the procedures that have to be worked out and all of this. This is my job. So I guess last year I spent researching the inside of the university. But before that, and as soon as this is done, and I retire, I have 2 more years of doing this, and I get back to my own research program, I write in the area of economic theory. I've written a number of papers well, you can divide economic theory up into roughly three main areas. There's decision theory, there is equilibrium theory, and then there's game theory. And I've written in all three areas, but I primarily write in equilibrium and game theory, and these days mostly in game theory. I have some research. I have a research program in game theory having to do with technical aspects of what we might mean by equilibrium of a game. So I won't go into that. That's pretty technical and wouldn't interest anyone who wasn't already involved. I've been working with Stephen Durlau for a number of years. We've been thinking about issues surrounding modeling of family dynamics, social mobility, and in particular, most recently, we've been concerned with measurement issues. What might it mean to say that, how might we measure social mobility? Income mobility is one thing. How do we measure occupational mobility? How do we interpret it? What might it mean? My interest is in providing theoretical models that might suggest what we should measure and how we should measure it. And related to that is that I've had a long interest in social networks. And social networks, I was one of the first people to think about doing games on networks. I might even have been the first. And I think that I'm particularly interested in this aspect of income mobility, how it is that our peers, our social situation determine the life opportunities that we have in front of us, right? So, one might say that, to study income mobility, for example, you need to know, how much your parents are earning, so how much are they going to invest in you going to college? And that's the whole story, this human capital investment story. But there's another story as well, and that is that our decisions are made by learning about the world from those around us. And so that's where understanding social networks and things like that come into play. So that's kind of a broad summary of what I'm interested in at the moment. You asked about teaching, and I should say that having said all of that, my teaching is I teach 2 courses a year at the university. One is in game theory and one is in general equilibrium theory. So are you really asking kind of what do I think are the key issues for developing economies? Well, I think that, an obvious thing to say is that you can either make policy at a whim, or you can make intelligent decisions about policy. And economists are not the sole source of intelligence for policy making, but they are one source. And how does one know what policies to try out? How does one measure the effects of a policy that you are trying out, right? This is what we teach. So there's an obvious role for economics right there. But beyond that, let's not even think about training economists. I think society works better when society is educated, when people have some knowledge of what's going on around them. I think that economic literacy is, in the modern world, economic literacy is really important for living your life. But I think we all need to be insulated from that. How are we insulated from that? We're insulated by way of education. We have our own knowledge, right? We know some things. And so when someone is preaching at us, we know this isn't fact, this is preaching, right? And so I think that economic education for economists is really important, obviously, and economists are important for social development, for all the different roles that you can imagine. But going beyond that, I think that economic knowledge is important for everybody. In my state, New York State, it is a requirement of the state of New York that economics be taught in high schools. It's a requirement for graduation, for getting a high school diploma in the state, that a student has taken an economics class. So I think it's something that has obvious benefits, but every time you have a requirement, right? You're crowding out other things that you could be doing. And I frankly don't know enough about the trade-offs in Uzbekistan to have anything intelligent to say about that. I can talk about the absolute value to society of having an economically literate population, but there are other things you want to teach as well, and it has to be a balance. But if you told me that you were going to do that, I would not think that that was a crazy thing to do. Right. I think, and by the way, I'm sure that New York is not the only state that does this. So depends upon the career. There are really three paths that I can think of. There is an academic path. One could become an academic economist, and by an academic economist, I don't necessarily mean I don't mean to highlight the teaching role. Teaching is obviously very important, but also, the role of a scholar or researcher like me. So that would include things like working in research institutes and things like that. A second path is to go and work for the government or government agencies, NGOs, things like this. Yeah, and the third path actually is to go up and work in the private sector. And I think the advice is really different depending upon which path you're on. In particular for people, if somebody right now said that I wanted to, I'm a freshman at the university, first-year student at the university, and I really want to work as an economist in a big private bank or something like that, that student should be preparing for master's programs in business economics. There are even PhD programs in business economics, and the subject, what's taught there is different than the high-end research materials, the high-end research methodologies that we teach in our PhD programs. And I have to say, I don't know much about that path, having never ever thought of taking it. Working for government and working in the academic sector, I think the preparation is pretty much the same because a lot of the work is the same. So for example, in academia, you find people who do policy analysis of, say, educational policy. You find them in the government. They talk to each other. They even write papers together. So that's a bigger community. At the end of the day, the policymakers and the academic economists might be interested in slightly different questions, but they have a lot of intersection. And at my university, we have a school of public policy. We have that is separate. Actually, I can't even say that it's separate from the economics department because many people who are in the economics department are in fact teaching in the School of Public Policy. And we regard ourselves as one large economics community. So that's not so different. And what one does in these programs is really to learn economic practice. We learn methodology, we learn what makes good research questions, and basically by working alongside people, learning how to do research. For students, how does one prepare for that? Funny that you should ask because I gave about an hour-long lecture on this morning. So I have too much to say, but I'll say very quickly that the way for students from Uzbekistan to get into top-tier PhD programs is most likely to attend master's programs. And the way to get in, and at most top American graduate programs, PhD programs, half or even maybe a little bit more of the students are coming in from a master's program. The other half coming in either directly from an undergraduate degree or an undergraduate degree and maybe a year or two of working. The master's programs are a very natural way in, and I think it's an easier way to get into the top PhD programs for students who are coming from universities where the faculties are small and not yet that well known, from places that the university has not taken students before, okay? We're all very risk averse when we're accepting students into our PhD programs. We know that if we've gotten 5 good students out of University X, then the 6th is likely to be, good too. And we don't have a lot of experience with graduate students from Central Asia. So master's programs help alleviate some of that risk. Now, what does it take to get into a master's program? What kind of training does one need? I think that students, one thing is that we all care about, the difficult part of economics is learning the methodological materials, learning economic theory, micro and macro, and learning econometrics at a reasonable level, statistics. And I think that most master's programs, and certainly PhD programs, worry, the question they first ask when looking at a student dossier, an application, is, will this student make it through that part of the program and be able to get on to the thesis research part? And so the best thing for students to do is to prepare for that, right? To take an appropriate set of math courses, I could give you a list, and take some statistics courses. Little computer programming isn't a bad thing to do, and get ready. The other thing I think well, there's two other things. I think it's important for students to sample around in the economics department and take courses in as many different areas of economics as they can, rather than drilling down, taking a lot of coursework in the one area of economics that interests them. I made that mistake when I was an undergraduate. I was really interested in economic theory, so I took a lot of economic theory, and I did not take a lot of applied economics courses. And I think that I've spent a lot of time in my life trying to make up for that mistake. Because after all, at the end of the day, why do we have these methodologies? Also, I think students are going to have to make decisions at some point about where their interests lie. And you can't make decisions, or you can't make good decisions, without information. And then the last thing is that for students going into an academic career, your undergraduate years are the last time in your life where you're going to be able to explore other stuff. If you have a little bit of interest in art or in history or something like that, you should really explore it at the university. And American universities are set up so that students can do exactly that. This is why we have what we call liberal arts colleges, and students don't enter a college to take only biology or only mathematics or something like that. They come into a college that has mathematics and biology and economics, and then they sample around among all of those. And I think students should do as much sampling as possible. It makes sorting into careers much more efficient, I think. And also, again, I think if you want to be a good economist, you can't know only economics. If you talk to someone like Ken Arrow, whom I mentioned earlier, I remember having dinner with him at his house some years ago, and he was quoting Shakespeare by the paragraph. He's very knowledgeable about history. I think that kind of breadth is really important, because if you think about what we do as an economist, number one, we're doing all this technical research with statistics and stuff like that. On the other hand, we're studying societies, and that means you have to know something about societies. Going beyond that, it's not, economic life doesn't exist outside of a larger social structure. So we need to know something about that. The social structures that we have and the political and governing structures that we have didn't come from nowhere. At Berkeley, where I was a PhD student, economic history was required back when I was a graduate student in the 70s, and it's still required now. So I took a course on the Industrial Revolution, for instance. I think that the good economists that I know, the ones that I really respect, one way or another, however they got it, they all have that kind of breadth. I think that's really important. Now, you can't get that in one day, and certainly, if you are a young student with aspirations, the first thing you should be thinking about is, here's the kind of program I want to go to. How do I look good for them? But you shouldn't forget these other things as well, because it's going to make a huge difference, not just to your career, but to your life later on. Long-winded answer. My university and many other universities, I think all the good universities in the United States have cooperative agreements with all kinds of universities where we exchange students. I know actually, for example, that my college has such a program with the university in Hanoi. Actually, I won't even begin to describe how many different relationships we have with universities around the world. I think that a natural place to start, well, there are two natural places to start. One is to exchange students, bring students from America to Central Asia. Most Americans, know nothing about Central Asia, right? Actually, I didn't know very much about Central Asia, which is why I was so eager to come when I was given the opportunity. Yeah. All right, well, so let me tell you, I knew about Timor, and I knew about the Timurid Empire, inaccurately, I have to say. And and I knew about the that there were places like the Uzbek SSR, right, and the whole Soviet thing, and beyond that, I had an image of land. Well, actually, my physical image of the land is, from what I can tell from the airplane, is pretty accurate. Okay, but high plains is a word we use in the United States for stuff like this. But I had, so the image I had growing up was, that it's nomadic and all of that. But then on the other hand, the Soviets are there, so there has to be manufacturing and big collective farms and so on and so forth. So what I'm going to say at the end is it's really, pretty inaccurate. And I, by the way, I certainly didn't appreciate until I came here the first time what a cultural center Tashkent is. I mean, I do know, for example, that I'm very interested in music. I listen to a lot of classical music, and of course, the Tashkent Conservatory is famous, right, world famous. So I knew about that. Not surprising, right, because Russians do this kind of thing, right? So wherever they go. So I knew about that. But I did not really appreciate how rich the intellectual history of Uzbekistan and all of the people who have lived in this region really is. I didn't appreciate that at all before. So that's kind of my image. It's pretty inaccurate. So in any event, to get back to so this is why, right? This is why it would be really good for universities to start sending people here. We shouldn't have this kind of ignorance. I think it would be really great, to have, for example, students from Uzbekistan walking around at Cornell. Again, there are two ways that Cornell students are going to get to learn something about Central Asia. We can send a few of them here, but a lot of them can meet students that you send to Cornell, right? So, and similarly with other institutions, this is pretty generic. So that's one direction. A collaboration. The other dimension of collaboration, of course, is to think what faculty can share. I don't know the answer to this question, but do we have faculty who have research interests in Central Asia? That would, so we could have faculty exchanges of different kinds. Again, one thing to do is to inventory your faculty and to see, who has Cornell connections. And I know you have a couple who do, actually, because I've met a few this time around. And I think that it's completely appropriate to reach out to our Vice Provost for International Affairs, International Relations, and say, gee, we're interested in having some kinds of cooperative programs. The administration of these dual degree programs is very difficult. The co-managing of standards on different campuses is very difficult. We identify, some classes that our students could take if they came here, and that your students would take if they came to Cornell, and there's a lot of that goes on, they just they come home with syllabi tucked in their briefcases, and we can look at the syllabi and say, yes, that looks completely appropriate to get course credit. So one way of thinking about this question is to ask, what can students really read on their own? There's a bunch of stuff you're going to teach them in the classroom. It's not worthwhile to say to students, why don't you go out and get a good microeconomic theory textbook and read it on your own? One thing I think that is worth reading is a bit of intellectual history. And why is it that the economics of Adam Smith and the economics of Alfred Marshall and the economics Arthur Pigou or John Hicks, why are they all so different? Okay, so I think that there are plenty of good books that anyone can read on what's called the history of economic thought. That's something, by the way, that many universities don't teach. It's taught at Cornell, but not in the economics department, interestingly. It's taught in the government department. So that's something I think that students should do. If students have a particular interest in, for example, thinking about developing the, what you can do for the Uzbek rural economy. All right. Then a very useful thing to do would be to read, for example, and I don't know who the authors would be, but there must be good ethnographies that would help people, say, students from who were, born and raised in Tashkent, come to understand a little bit of what life in other parts of the country are actually like. Again, I think that it's important, I said this earlier, to have domain expertise, right? To know, not just the tools of your trade, to know something about the materials to which you're applying them. And I think that's very useful to do. Another thing that students can do on their own is to build up programming skills. It's not very hard to learn how to program a computer. Probably, I'm going to guess that students from the good high schools have already had a computer programming course of some kind. So what do you need? Our students, in our classes, we have number of our classes, we have students do computer programming, and they're programming statistical stuff in R. Occasionally they're programming simulations in Python. We have some researchers who use MATLAB, and we have students who are programming in that. That's not too different from Python, don't quote me on that, but I think it's really good for students to have data projects that they can work on over the summer. Maybe that's something that your faculty could develop here. Everybody goes home with a project. Not necessarily for credit or anything like that, but if you really want to go to graduate school, why don't you think about this, and we'll talk about it in the fall. So I don't know, that's not too much, but I think those are places to start. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this interview, and again, I want to say what a pleasure it was to be here for this week, and how exciting I found the students to be, and how enjoyable it was to teach in the summer school. So thank you again.